Welcome to This Month in Type 1 Research. Please check the description for the original sources, and all content is general in nature and should not be considered medical advice. Wow, November. November has been crazy. So much research is coming out. We've got a really interesting mix to look at this time. We have clinical trials showing us the cutting edge, real-world studies seeing how things work in everyday life, and even some deep dive review articles to give us that bigger picture context.
It's definitely a dynamic time to be following type 1 research, that's for sure.
I was really interested by a study from mainland China. They are looking at open source automated insulin delivery systems, or AID. It really made me think about how accessible this kind of cutting edge tech is around the world.
Yeah. This study followed 292 people with type 1 in China, using an open source system running on, get this, Android phones.
Wow.
What they found was pretty remarkable. After just 3 months, over 82% of the participants achieved an A1C under 7. And importantly, they didn't see any severe hypos or DKA throughout the entire study.
Those results are incredible. That makes you wonder, is the open source aspect a key factor here? Could the ability to customize and tinker lead to better outcomes than commercially available systems? Something to think about.
That's a really insightful point. It does raise the question of whether the ability to adapt the technology to individual needs and preferences contributes to better adherence and ultimately better glucose control. Maybe having that level of control empowers people to manage their diabetes more effectively.
So open source tech possibly leading to better outcomes. Fascinating. Now let's talk about a study that honestly bummed me out a bit. The Fenofibrate trial. There was so much initial excitement about this drug and its potential to preserve beta cell function. The preclinical studies, remember, were incredibly promising. So what happened?
Yeah. Unfortunately, this phase 2 trial involving 58 adults and adolescents with newly diagnosed type 1 didn't see that same level of success. They received either Fenofibrate or a placebo for a year, and there was no significant improvement in beta cell function in the Fenofibrate group.
It's a good reminder for us all to be cautious about getting swept up in early hype. To really look at the science and understand the nuances before we get our hopes up.
Yeah.
But you always learn something.
Right.
Even when a study doesn't have the outcome you were hoping for.
Absolutely, in fact. This study revealed something unexpected. There's some evidence that suggests Fenofibrate might actually increase beta cell stress. They found changes in certain markers that point to this, and follow-up experiments in lab settings also showed that Fenofibrate seemed to stress out those precious beta cells.
Okay. So we've got potential breakthroughs in tech and a reminder that even promising drugs need rigorous testing. Now, I wanted to zoom out a bit. Let's talk about beta cell replacement. We came across a really comprehensive review article that gives us a good overview of where things stand in this quest to, well, essentially cure type 1.
This review really lays out the two main approaches researchers are focusing on: transplantation and stem cell research. With transplantation, whether it's a whole pancreas or just the islet cells, there's always the issue of donor scarcity. And even when a transplant is possible, you've got the challenge of immune rejection, meaning you're on immunosuppressants for life.
It does feel like we're constantly on the verge of a major breakthrough with beta cell replacement, but the path is definitely long and winding. Stem cell research is the other avenue. What's the latest there?
Stem cells hold tremendous potential, especially with the advancements in human embryonic stem cells and induced pluripotent stem cells. We're talking about a potentially unlimited source of beta cells, but there are still significant challenges. How do you produce functional beta cells in large enough quantities? And how do you protect them from the immune system's attack once they're transplanted?
Two massive hurdles. Okay, let's shift gears to a topic I know you're hearing a lot about these days, the gut microbiome. We had 2 studies this month that focused on the connection between gut bacteria and type 1 diabetes. One was a molecular review, really getting into the nitty-gritty science, and the other was an actual trial using probiotics and fiber. Now, I've got to admit, this is where things get really exciting for me. The idea that these little bacteria in our gut could be influencing the development of type 1 is mind-blowing.
It's definitely a hot topic in research right now, and for good reason. We're learning that the gut microbiome has a profound impact on our overall health, including the immune system.
Break it down for me. How are gut bacteria potentially linked to type 1?
The theory is that an imbalance in gut bacteria, what we call dysbiosis, can lead to a disruption of the gut barrier. This barrier is meant to keep things in check, but when it's compromised, certain molecules can leak into the bloodstream. And some researchers believe these molecules might be the trigger that sets off the autoimmune attack on beta cells.
Interesting. So the review article explains the background. But what about that trial using probiotics and fiber? Did it work? Could this be a way to manipulate the gut microbiome and prevent or slow down the autoimmune attack?
This trial, called the PRO-FOS study, followed 41 people with type 1 who also had albuminuria, which is a sign of kidney damage. They received either a mix of prebiotics and probiotics or a placebo for 12 weeks. And unfortunately, there was no significant effect on UACR, a marker of kidney damage.
Bummer. It seems like we're still just scratching the surface of understanding this complex interplay between gut health and type 1, but I'm still really excited about this area of research. What if we could actually modulate the gut microbiome to benefit those with type 1? That would be incredible.
Absolutely. And it's not just about type 1. The gut microbiome is being investigated for its role in so many different health conditions. It's a rapidly evolving field, and I think we'll see some really interesting developments in the coming years.
Okay. Before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, there's one more study I want to touch on, and it's a little different from what we've discussed so far. It involved teenagers, a meditation app, and dot stress management.
Yes. This small study was looking at how a meditation app called the Healthy Minds program could help teenagers with type 1 manage stress and develop coping skills. Remember, stress can really throw off blood sugar control, so finding ways to manage it is super important for overall well-being.
Right. I remember those teenage years. And stress was definitely a constant companion. But I'm curious, did the teenagers actually buy into the whole meditation app thing?
Well, it sounds like they were pleasantly surprised. They found the app easy to use and helpful, but like many of us, they struggled with finding the time to use it consistently. It's a good reminder that addressing mental health alongside physical health is crucial, but it's not always easy to integrate these practices into our busy lives.
So true. All right, we'll pause our deep dive here for now, but don't go anywhere. We've got a lot more ground to cover in part 2, including a fascinating look at CGM use in a summer camp setting and a promising program aimed at making the transition from pediatric to adult care smoother. See you in a bit.
See you then. You know, while those new technologies and potential treatments are really exciting, I always find myself drawn back to the fundamental research that's helping us understand the immune system's role in type 1 diabetes. There was a really intriguing study this month that looked at T-cell auto-reactivity, basically, how our immune system recognizes and reacts to our own body's tissues.
Right, T cells. Those are the white blood cells that are supposed to protect us from invaders. But in type 1, they sort of go rogue and attack the beta cells.
Right, exactly. And what's fascinating is that everyone has some degree of T-cell autoreactivity. It's actually a normal part of a healthy immune system. This study, however, zeroed in on T cells that react to a specific protein called GAD-65, one of the key autoantigens in type 1 diabetes.
Now, remind me, autoantigens. Those are the proteins that the immune system mistakenly targets in type 1.
Right.
Sometimes they need a little refresher on the terminology.
You got it. And this study found that GAD-65 specific T cells are present in both healthy people and those with type 1. But here's the key. They observed some critical differences in the way these T cells behaved in each group.
Okay, this is where I need you to break it down for me. What were the differences? And why does it matter?
Well, the researchers suggest that a certain level of what they call physiological autoimmunity against GAD-65 might actually be beneficial in early life. It's like a training ground for the immune system, helping it learn to distinguish between the body's own tissues and foreign invaders. But in individuals who are predisposed to type 1, these normal processes seem to go awry, potentially leading to the development of the disease.
So it's not simply the presence of these GAD-65 specific T cells that's the problem. It's more about how they function and how the immune system as a whole reacts to them. It's like a delicate dance. And if one partner steps on the other's toes, things can go wrong.
That's a perfect analogy. And this study provides a glimpse into the complexity of that dance, showing us the subtle differences that can tip the balance towards autoimmunity.
That's amazing. It really makes you wonder if we can pinpoint these subtle differences. Could we find ways to prevent or even reverse the autoimmune attack in type 1?
That's the big question, isn't it? And research like this is laying the foundation for new therapeutic approaches that go beyond simply managing blood sugar and aim to address the root cause of the disease.
Wow, that's a powerful thought. Okay, before we get too lost in the future of potential cures, let's bring it back down to earth for a moment. One of the last studies I wanted to touch on looked at something that affects a lot of us, regardless of whether we have type 1 or not: sitting. Specifically, the risk of cardiovascular problems in people with type 1 who spend a lot of time sitting at work. Now, I've definitely been guilty of logging long hours at my desk, so this one caught my attention.
This study, which followed over 1,700 people with type 1 in Finland for an average of 12.5 years, found that excessive sitting, especially in the workplace, is linked to an increased risk of cardiovascular events. And this was true even for those who were managing their type 1 well.
So even if you're doing all the right things, checking your blood sugar, counting carbs, exercising regularly, spending hours and hours glued to a chair can still be bad news for your heart. That's a pretty sobering thought.
It's a good reminder that diabetes management is about so much more than just blood sugar control. It's about a holistic approach to health that includes regular physical activity, a healthy diet, stress management, and yes, even being mindful of how much time we spend sitting each day.
So what's the solution here? Do we all need to quit our desk jobs and become yoga instructors?
Haha, I don't think that's necessary. But it does highlight the importance of incorporating movement into our daily routines. Even small things like taking short breaks to stand up, stretch, and walk around can make a difference. And if you have a job that requires you to sit for long periods, talk to your doctor about strategies to minimize the risks.
Right, it's all about those small changes that can add up to big benefits over time. And we were talking earlier about how those summer camp studies always catch my eye. Well, this month we had one that looked at real-time CGM use in a summer camp setting. And it sounds like there were some interesting observations.
This particular study involves 7 children and adolescents with type 1, and the researchers found that while the healthcare providers were pretty enthusiastic about using real-time CGM in this setting, the campers themselves weren't quite as sold.
Really? That's surprising. I would have thought kids would be all about the latest tech gadgets. What was their hesitation about? Was it accuracy issues?
Accuracy was definitely a factor. The study found that while real-time CGM provided valuable insights, there were times when the readings didn't quite line up with traditional blood glucose meter readings. And in a dynamic environment like summer camp, where activities, emotions, and schedules are constantly changing, that can be a bit tricky to navigate.
So it's a reminder that technology, even cutting-edge tech, isn't a magic bullet. It's a tool that needs to be used thoughtfully and in conjunction with good clinical judgment.
Exactly. It's about empowering both individuals with diabetes and their healthcare teams to make informed decisions based on a combination of data, experience, and individual context. And sometimes that means taking CGM readings with a grain of salt and considering all the factors that might be influencing those numbers.
Great point. And speaking of empowering individuals, let's talk about that transition from pediatric to adult diabetes care. It's a time that can be challenging for young adults as they navigate a new healthcare system and take on more responsibility for their own diabetes management. We came across a study from Canada that offers some promising insights into how to make this transition smoother.
This study, conducted across 5 pediatric diabetes centers in Ontario, tested an audit and feedback program designed to improve A1C levels in the year after young adults transition to adult care. Basically, it involved providing structured data and support to both the individuals transitioning and their new healthcare teams.
So the idea is that good communication and data sharing can really make a difference during this potentially vulnerable time. That's reassuring to hear.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of collaborative care and ensuring a smooth handoff between pediatric and adult healthcare systems to optimize long-term outcomes for young adults with type 1. Knowing that there are programs and strategies in place to support this transition can be empowering for both the young person and their families.
And that leads us nicely to another area of research that I always find interesting, the psychological and emotional aspects of living with type 1. This month, there was a study that looked at the impact of diabetes distress on self-care behaviors in adults with type 1.
This study explored the link between diabetes distress, those feelings of burnout, worry, and frustration that can come with managing a chronic condition like type 1, and how well people adhere to their self-care routines. What they found was that higher levels of diabetes distress were associated with poor adherence to things like blood glucose monitoring, healthy eating, and physical activity.
That makes sense, doesn't it? If you're feeling overwhelmed and burnt out, it's harder to stay on top of everything. But it creates this sort of vicious cycle. Diabetes distress leads to poorer self-care, which can then lead to worse blood sugar control and more complications, which in turn can fuel more distress.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of addressing the emotional and psychological aspects of diabetes management alongside the physical aspects. We need to be talking about diabetes distress more openly and providing people with the resources and support they need to cope effectively.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I think we've given our listener a lot to think about already. Let's take a quick break and come back for our final round of research insights. All right, we're back for our final round of research insights for November. We've covered a lot, from promising technologies to the complexities of the immune system, and even the impact of something as simple as sitting. I always find it fascinating how these deep dives reveal the interconnectedness of it all. You know,
It really highlights that type 1 diabetes is multifaceted, and it underscores the need for a holistic approach to research and care.
exactly. And speaking of holistic care, we touched earlier on the transition from pediatric to adult care. I think that's a topic that deserves a little more attention, as it can be a really pivotal time for young adults with type 1. There was one more study this month that caught my eye in this area. It focused on the experiences of young adults during this transition.
Yeah. This study was a qualitative one, meaning it focused on gathering in-depth insights from the participants rather than hard data points. They interviewed 15 young adults with type 1 about their experiences transitioning to adult care, and some common themes emerged.
I'm always interested in hearing directly from people living with type 1. What were some of the key takeaways? What did these young adults share about their experiences?
Well, a big one was a sense of feeling lost and unsupported during the transition. Many of them described feeling like they were falling through the cracks between pediatric and adult care systems. There was also a sense of being overwhelmed by the increased responsibility for self-management.
That's really tough to hear. But unfortunately, it's not surprising. It reinforces the need for better communication and coordination between pediatric and adult care teams, as well as more support systems in place to help young adults navigate this transition successfully.
Absolutely. And it also underscores the importance of empowering young people to advocate for their own needs and to seek out resources and support when they need it.
So true. Okay. Before we wrap things up, I wanted to circle back to something we discussed earlier, the role of the gut microbiome in type 1 diabetes. There was one more study this month that caught my eye in this area, and it focused on a very specific type of bacteria called Akkermansia mucinifila. Now, I know that's a mouthful, but it seems like this little bacteria might be a key player in the gut health puzzle.
Akkermansia mucinifila is a fascinating bacterium. It's actually been shown to have beneficial effects on gut health and metabolism in other contexts, and researchers are now exploring its potential role in type 1 diabetes.
So what did this particular study find? Was there a connection between Akkermansia mucinifila and type 1?
This study looked at the levels of Akkermansia mucinifila in the gut microbiome of children who were at high risk of developing type 1. Based on genetic testing, they found that children who went on to develop type 1 had significantly lower levels of this bacterium in their gut compared to those who didn't develop the disease.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's more evidence pointing to the potential role of the gut microbiome in the development of type 1. But like we discussed earlier, it's still early days in this area of research. We need more studies to confirm these findings and to understand exactly how Akkermansia mucinifila might be influencing the autoimmune process.
Exactly, but it's definitely an area to watch. Imagine if we could one day manipulate the gut microbiome, perhaps through targeted probiotics or other interventions, to increase the levels of beneficial bacteria like Akkermansia mucinifila and potentially prevent or delay the onset of type 1. That would be a significant step forward.
Absolutely. It's exciting to see the research progressing on so many fronts.
Yeah.
I think we've officially reached the end of our November research deep dive. It's been an incredibly insightful journey, wouldn't you say?
I completely agree. It's always inspiring to see the progress that's being made in understanding and managing type 1 diabetes.
I hope our listener feels informed and empowered by the knowledge we've shared today. It's a complex and ever-evolving landscape, but staying curious and informed is key. And remember, research is an ongoing process. There are always new discoveries on the horizon.
That's a great point. What we've discussed today is just a snapshot in time. The research continues. And with it, the hope for better treatments, prevention strategies, and ultimately, a cure for type 1 diabetes.
I love that. The hope for a cure. It's what keeps us all going. So to our listener out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of type 1 research. Remember to like and subscribe, and thank you for listening.